our posture should be to serve the Lord, to do what God's called us to do, and leave that up to Him, okay? He is the one who makes great nations and makes people's names great. But notice also, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And so if we back up all the way to Genesis 1, He blessed them and said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. You fast forward to Genesis, I think it's Genesis 9, where He says to Noah, He comes back and repeats that idea of blessing and being fruitful and multiplying. And now He comes to Abraham and He says, you will have many descendants, and I will bless all peoples on earth through you. Now, last week we ended up talking about Genesis 13 through 15, and particularly with 15, we talked about this idea of a covenant. Okay, and a little bit later on, I think we've got a video. You got the video? Okay, we don't have to do it right now. A little bit later on, we're going to take some time and watch a video about covenants. Okay, and so I'm not going to spoil that right now, but Genesis 15 is about the ratification of that promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. Okay, and so Genesis 12, opening verses, Genesis 15, and Genesis 17, as we're going to look at tonight, all deal with this idea of covenant. And this is how God operates. And one of the things I want us to keep in mind is that this is how God has chosen, and never want us to forget this, this just amazes me. This is how God has chosen to fulfill His work in the world, is through us. He could announce it, He could write something in the clouds, He could say something with an audible voice, but right from the very beginning, Genesis chapter 1, okay, coming back Genesis chapter 6 with Noah, coming back Genesis chapter 12 with the family of Abraham. Over and over and over again, He chooses to fulfill His purpose through human beings, okay? That's our job, and guess what? He's still doing it today. God is fulfilling His purposes on earth through people who are obedient to Him, people who walk in faith, people who go out in their commitment to the Lord. So tonight, let's look at Genesis chapter 16, and you've got the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Okay, so tonight we're just looking at Genesis 16, 17. When we get 17, I'm going to show a short video clip about covenants. But for now, let's look at Genesis 16, verse 1. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then, I've been calling her Sarah, Sarai at this point, said to Abram, you're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands. Abram said, do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. So let's stop right there and begin to break down a few things. Now, what's kind of if we back up a chapter and we go to Genesis chapter 15, what's really the entire point of Genesis 15? What's going on in Genesis 15?
I think that Abraham believed the Lord.
Abraham believed God. It was credited to him as righteousness. I think that's like verse 6 or something, chapter 15. Verse 6, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Now, okay, now what did he believe? Count the stars, because what is it about the stars? That's how many children you're going to have. That's kind of the whole point of Genesis 15. He builds up this big promise, and Abraham believes God, and he credits it to him as righteousness. And you come to chapter 16, verse 1. Now, Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And then they began to come up with this plan. They begin to.
How many years do you think that was?
Okay, I wrote this down somewhere. I know, okay, Abram was 75 when God first called him and promised to make him a great nation. And now he is 86 years old. Okay? So, yeah, so about 11 years. Yeah. So, 11 years. So, a lot going on here, but it's just interesting thematically how you move from one chapter, and this is a big crescendo promise, one of the major chapters in Genesis, and then you come into Genesis 16, and it's like, and there's a problem. And so I think there's a lot for us to glean from that God's going to work in our lives, and a lot of times He's going to call us to do something, and what are we talking about? 11 years go by. 11 years go by, and radio silence for the most part. Okay? Now, how many of you, God's called you to do something, and man, you start out like a flame of fire, you're charging hell with a water pistol, you're like, put me in, coach, I'm ready to play. And then a few weeks go by, a few months go by, you have a few setbacks, your emotions kind of die down, and then that's when it gets hard. That's when it gets hard. And one of the things that I love about this church right now that's going on is there's so many ministries going on, but I can promise you in a lot of those ministries there were periods and seasons of time where it seemed like a lot of radio silence, a lot of setbacks and obstacles, and that's where it gets tough. Okay? But Genesis 16, Abram's wife Sarah had borne him no children, so that's an obstacle. Genesis 12, as we had up here on the board earlier, that's the promise. This is what I'm doing. This is how I'm working. And Genesis is about all of these obstacles to that promise. What is God doing in Genesis? God is revealing His plan to redeem His fallen creation through Abraham's family. That's what He's doing. Remember, who's the first folks reading this? Israelites, okay. We don't exactly know perhaps all the context of that, but we know a lot of it is that Moses is making a case for who are we? We are God's people. What are we supposed to be doing? We're supposed to be coming into this promised land. And right now in Genesis, he's telling the story of God's plan to redeem His fallen creation through His family. He's answering the question, what is God going to do to redeem fallen creation? And the answer is He's going to work through the family of Abraham. Now let's fast forward a little bit, all the way to Exodus chapter 19. How's God going to redeem humanity? Through Abraham's family. If we fast forward, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob is named Israel. He has, from him come the 12 tribes of Israel, and ultimately the nation of Israel. And then in Exodus 19 verse 4, start reading at verse 3. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So His plan is to work through this nation to be a light to other nations, okay? And a light meaning, okay, this is how we're supposed to live as human beings, and this is the one true God we're to worship, okay? Other nations are supposed to peer over the fence and look in and see how they're operating with justice and humility and fairness and kindness. They're supposed to look over and see how they're operating and see the God that they're exclusively worshiping and say, oh, that's what it means to live in righteousness. That's the right way to live. They're to be priests, a kingdom of priests of the nations. Ultimately, God's plan is going to be fulfilled in whom? The Lord Jesus Christ, okay? Isaiah 11 It talks about this time where the wolf will lie down with the lamb and so forth. All right, so that was all a little bit of fast forward. Let's bounce back again to Genesis chapter 16. There's that word, that name, Sarai, and later her name is changed to Sarah. This word means princess and queen, and I have a lot of research that I've put into that word there. My wife's name is Sarah, by the way. Anyway, so there you go. There you go. That's exactly right. That is exactly right. Okay. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. So Hagar is, by the way, means to flee, okay? And she is a maidservant. She would have been property of not only Abraham, but her, particularly her mistress. You'll notice verse 2, it says she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children, so go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." In the ancient world, just the way it operated, women obtained honor in two primary ways. One would be through marriage, okay, marrying into a reputable family. And that was just an honor in that society to be married. But then also through childbearing, okay? So that was in that culture. A lot of times how women obtain honor through childbearing and through marriage. And society at large generally considered barrenness a female problem, okay? And that's why, like, the gods perhaps were judging, okay? In their situation, Yahweh did not have favor on her, is what they would think. And that's why she uses the language, "The Lord has kept me from having children." Yahweh has kept me from having children. So in this context, Hagar is going to function kind of like a concubine. She's not going to be considered of equal status or value as Sarah. And she basically is going to serve as a surrogate mother, okay? Now, this, in other literature of that time, this is pretty common practice. Code of Hammurabi had language that described certain policies or procedures you would follow if the wife was barren, what to do. And so they're actually following something that's very common in that culture, and she would have basically served as a surrogate mother bearing the child. Okay, any questions about those opening verses? Notice in verse 4, says, Abraham agreed to what Sarah said. Verse 3, after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave, Hagar, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. Now, notice, I'm bouncing a little bit, but notice a little bit earlier how Sarah said, I can build a family through her. So it's possible that she thought, okay, God's made this promise to Abraham, or to my husband Abram, and so it's possible she thought, okay, God's going to operate through him and not through me, and so this is the way that we're going to get this done. But notice how she said, perhaps I can build a family through her, and that's because Hagar would have been the legal extension of Sarai. But again, as we skip down, verse 5, then Sarai said, verse 4, midway through verse 4, when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. She began to despise her mistress. Literally, she looked small in her eyes. Okay? Interesting way to say that. That's literally what it means. She looked small in her eyes. Now remember, one of the primary ways you receive honor is through, in that culture, through bearing children. Sarai wasn't able to do that. Hagar was. And so she began to despise her and treat her with contempt. In other words, she kind of saw herself as getting a promotion, and she saw Sarai, in a sense, as getting a demotion. Okay, and that's kind of, I think, the play behind this. But notice what it says in verse 5. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You're responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." There's that word where she says, "For the wrong I am suffering." Okay? Also a word that means injustice. The Hebrew vocabulary is much smaller than English, and so a lot of times they would use one word to cover a lot of ground. The word could also mean violence, like a strong, fierce, destructive force. Could mean destruction, could even mean plunder. And you say, well, what Hebrew word is that? You may have heard of this word before. It's the Hebrew word Hamas. Hamas. So that's just an interesting side note there for you. A word that can describe deceit and general disregard for law and human life. It's used earlier in Genesis. And for some reason I did not write down the reference, but I think I remember it. Genesis 6, verse 11, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of Hamas," was full of violence. Okay? So a very strong word for her to use. This is a moment of intense fellowship between a husband and a wife. She is not happy at this point because of the dynamic that this has caused in their family, where Hagar seems to be honored and she's feeling small, perhaps, as it says with the way that Hagar saw her. You are responsible, Abraham, for the Hamas, for the wrong, the injustice I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. She sees me as small. Okay, may the Lord judge between you and me. She's basically like, what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about this? Okay, and so then we pick up at verse 6. "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best." Do with her whatever you think best. And Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Her name means to flee. And so at this point, she's been treated so poorly that she runs away. And that is the opening scene of Genesis 16. What questions, comments do we have? Ms. D.
So, Sai, she was she started off, now, is she trying to blame herself by blaming Abraham for her mistake? She couldn't wait upon the Lord. Now, the fact that Hagar could have done what she couldn't do.
Yeah.
And she despised her.
Yeah, and obviously in this situation, I think Sarai is they're both in the wrong. But Sarai is in the wrong, obviously, for the way she's treating Hagar. She's the one who came up with this dynamic. And it is possible that she thought in her mind, okay, well, God's not giving a child through me. I mean, they are on up there in years, okay? And we're not going to say they're old, because we could have people in this room that are older than this. But we're going to say they're on up there in years. And she's like, we've been waiting now for 11 years. Nothing's happened. And so it's possible she thought, okay, God must be going to do this in a different way because it's not happening through me. And so she devises this plan, but then she doesn't like the result of her plan. It's kind of like Jonah, who doesn't want to go preach at Nineveh because he knows the plan will work, you know. And he's like, sure enough, I preached and people got saved, and it was terrible, God. And here you got a situation where she came up with a plan, and she doesn't like the outcome of the plan because of the dynamic that it caused. And so she definitely mistreated her, treated her harshly, so much that she left.
This challenges me about the responsibility of women in the family, like Adam and Eve. I mean, Adam got the promises, and Eve manipulated into eating the apple. She thought that was best in her own has. And the same thing here. You know, he got the promises. She got a promise too. But time passes, and so she's not willing to wait. She's using that manipulative power as a woman to change his mind.
Yeah.
Which is so evil.
But let me be clear. I don't think Abraham comes out squeaky clean in this situation either. Sure. Okay. Okay, she started. All right. I hear what you're saying. Yeah, sure. I am too, brother. Yes, sir. Yeah. That would be interesting. I think a lot of that in their culture would have depended on what Abraham wanted to do, okay? And if he had it within him, like, hey, you have my child and so forth, then he could have perhaps gone after her. And of course, the laws back then are much different. It's geographically based, you know, from city to city, from family to family in many ways. But so a lot would just depend on what he wanted to do, and if he felt like he had been wronged by her leaving and wanted to go after her to get his son back, then he would have had the power to do it and probably inflict some kind of punishment on her. So, but yeah. Any other questions, comments? Abraham, yeah. Talking about Ishmael. Yes, yes, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. Okay, so then we pick up at verse 7. Says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert, and it was a spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. I'm sorry. Verse 9. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery, and he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Okay, so a few things as we begin to work through this. Angel, of course, as many of you know, means messenger, Old Testament and New Testament. Angel of Yahweh, Malach Yahweh. And so this is like some kind of visible, embodied form of this angel that has this announcement for Hagar and this word for Hagar. When we get to Ishmael, his name literally means God hears. Okay, and very interesting that she flees. And one of the things we do know is that she would have taken great risk upon herself to leave. Okay. If you were here Sunday, we talked about how important it was, even in Jesus' day, for the livelihood of women generally to be connected to a family, okay, connected to typically a man. Now, you have outliers like Lydia, okay, you have outliers like Joanna in the New Testament and very wealthy women. But generally speaking, their livelihood, particularly in the days of Hagar, was really depended upon their connection to men. And so the fact that she leaves all of that means that she is leaving protection. She is leaving, basic necessities of life in order to survive. So she really is at a desperation point for her to be mistreated so badly that she's willing to just run, knowing that she's putting her life and the life of the child at risk. And so the angel of Yahweh confronts her and meets her. And this is a very gracious thing, I believe, for, of course, the angel to do this and say, go back to your mistress and submit to her. Now, I find this prophecy very interesting because generally we see this as God having favor to extent at least on Hagar. Okay, she's going to have a child. That's seen as a blessing. And now this angel is intervening on her behalf to send her back, really probably ultimately saving her life. And now we're going to have this baby announcement. And I don't know about you, but if an angel dropped down and gave me this announcement for one of my kids, I'd be like, anything else you could say that might be a little bit better than he's going to be a wild donkey of a man? But did you have something? Strong. Okay, yeah. And we'll get to that. But he says, now you're pregnant. You'll give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, which means God hears me. For the Lord has heard of your misery. So this indicates compassion. It indicates that God cares for her. He will be a wild donkey of a man. I do think it includes strong, particularly if you think about a donkey, okay? Now, my dad, his favorite animal on the planet was a mule, okay? And I don't know why, but it just was. And a donkey, and we won't get into how they differ and all that. But anyway, you've got this donkey, and what are donkeys typically known for? Stubbornness, okay? So the idea here, I believe, is that he's really going to be headstrong, okay? He's going to be headstrong, and the following lines spoken over him, I think, back this up. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. Okay? Now, again, I'd be like, angel, did the Lord tell you anything else? Anything else you can say to me? Because that's not really something you want to hear, but he's speaking truth, that this is going to be the life of Ishmael. Very interesting verse 13, then we need to wrap this up, get to chapter 17. She gave this name to Yahweh, who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me, for she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. This is the only time, I believe in all of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, where anyone gives a name to the Lord. The only occasion where this happens. The Hebrew phrase is El Roi. Okay, El, God, El Roi, which means God of my seeing, or God of seeing. You are the God who sees me. Okay, and that would imply at least that perhaps was her struggle, that she felt unseen, unheard, and in part that may have been what drove her out, that she had kind of just been discarded. She had been brought up for this role, and she had fulfilled her obligation. She's now carrying a child, and now she's been mistreated to the point where she had to flee, and she's alone in the wilderness, and now God sees her. God cares for her. He has heard of your misery, as it says in verse 11. But the only time in the Bible where God is given a name, and that place is even given a name. Okay, any questions y'all have for chapter 16 before we move to chapter 17 and begin to wrap things up? Yes, sir. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
by having a surrogate, and then she ran away because she felt like, what would it be, jealousy?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
I would think there was a lot of jealousy
Mm-hmm.
there. And then, you know, she runs away, and felt like she wasn't seen by God because, you know, it's like, oh, well, I just got impregnated by this
Mm-hmm.
man, and then I left because
Yeah.
he was already married, and you know what I mean? So you
Yeah.
kind of like, what's God think about all this? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the commandments, you know, and
Sure.
adultery, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how, you know, aggressive it was, you know,
Sure.
in this time where if it was even
Yeah.
brought up. Was Moses, did all this already take place?
No, Moses hadn't come along yet.
Okay, so there's no.
And it was, and as I was saying earlier, it was a common practice in that culture. This is how you dealt with barrenness. Okay? And so, you know, we don't have the law of Moses at this point. Not to say that it was right or anything like that, but it was just a common practice. And so that's why he really didn't question it that much. Like, okay, yeah, this is the thing we've got to do. And I do think it shows a break of faith on his part in particular, because God has made this promise to him. And he was supposed to wait and do things the way that God had intended. So, but yeah, and that's one of the, I think, the great challenges of reading and studying the Bible is this is a culture that really we would struggle to make sense of today. Some of the laws that we read, we struggle to make sense of them today because we don't have a context for that today. Yes, sir.
You said at the outset, tonight, you said that God uses humans to accomplish his purposes. Do you think that that's what Abraham was thinking at that time? Thinking nothing's happened, and since God uses humans to accomplish his purposes, maybe this is, maybe I'm actually doing God's will when I, come up with some idea. And I guess the follow-up is why didn't he ask God, am I doing this right, or did I understand you, or...
Yeah.
It would have been a good idea.
It would have been a good idea to pick up the phone, wouldn't it?
It wasn't Abraham, it was Sarai who tried to help the Lord.
Yeah.
Because the Lord promised Abraham. So by Hagar being pregnant is still the Lord helping Abraham.
Yeah.
Allow her to get pregnant. And even though in her misfortune, God still blessed Hagar.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think one of the big takeaways from Genesis and so many other places in the Bible is how God accomplishes his purposes through imperfect people. Quite often we are an obstacle to what God is trying to do through us because we don't surrender to him in faith and just do things the way he's called us to do them. And yet God still works, and that's not to say, okay, go out and try to be imperfect. That's not the point. But it is to say that whatever situation we find ourselves in, God can still work through us. He can still use us. It might be in a different way. It might be in a different format. But God works through imperfect people. Okay, I want to get...
I have one question.
Yes, yes.
Hagar.
Hagar.
She was probably from the Chaldeans, right?
Yeah, I think she had an Egyptian
She was
background.
Egyptian.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So she was a Gentile slave.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
I was thinking about calls of Abraham or Hagar had to have this relationship with God, because how else would God know that she was suffering? If she's not talking to us?
yeah, and you know, it's interesting. A lot of times, whatever religion the householder had, generally everybody else followed suit. Okay, and this in the New Testament becomes a big problem because you have people who are coming to faith in Jesus Christ, and they might be in situations where that wasn't the dominant belief of the person over the household. But yeah, she would have she'd been familiar with Yahweh. She may have thought she was not seen or heard, and this changed her perspective, I think, on all that. Yes, seeing the messenger of God. Yes, sir. You could make that case that it's the pre-incarnate Christ. Some people would believe that because it says she gave this name to Yahweh who spoke to her. So this is Yahweh speaking to her. You've got someone who looks like a messenger embodied, and so that would bring a lot of people to draw the conclusion this is the pre-incarnate Christ. I will increase your descendants. Yeah. So I think that's a fair conclusion to draw. All right. So what I want to do now, we're about to come to chapter 17, and I want to talk a little bit about covenants, because this is kind of how God ultimately is fulfilling His plan throughout the generation. So we have a video we're going to show, about 4-ish minutes video, and it's like an animated version. If you're like me, I'm a visual learner, and so it helps to kind of see things, but this will kind of put in a nutshell the various covenants in the Bible, how they operate, and then we'll talk a little bit about Genesis chapter 17.
If you've been around Christians, you've probably heard of
want
the
to bring it
idea
up.
of having a personal relationship with God, which could mean different things in the Bible, like having God as a friend, or your father, or maybe your teacher.
But there's one particular way that the Bible talks about this relationship that you find all over. But strangely, we don't talk about it that much. And that's the idea of a partnership with God.
A partnership like working alongside someone to accomplish a goal together.
Right, and this is actually what you see at the beginning of the Bible. God creates this good world full of all of this potential. And then God appoints these unique creatures, humans, as his partners in bringing more and more goodness out of all that potential.
But the humans don't want to partner with God. They rebel and try to create a world on their own terms.
And so this broken partnership is the Bible's explanation for why we're stuck in a world of corruption and injustice and the tragedy of death.
It's not like there's just one or two humans who have bailed on this relationship. In the story of the Bible, everyone has abandoned the partnership with God.
So what God does is select a smaller group of people out of the many, and he makes a new partnership with them called a covenant. And in a covenant, God makes promises, and then in exchange asks his partner to fulfill certain commitments. And the purpose of all of this is to somehow use this covenant relationship to renew his partnership with everybody else.
Now, there are actually 4 times in the Old Testament that we're told God initiates a covenant relationship with Noah, Abraham, the nation of Israel, and King David.
And it's through these that God is forming a covenant family into which all people will eventually be invited.
So let's see how these work. The first one is with Noah.
So in this story, God has just brought the flood to cleanse the world of humanity's corruption, and Noah and his family are the only ones left. And so God makes a covenant with Noah, saying, listen, I know that humans will continue to be evil, but despite that, I'm not going to destroy it like this again. Instead, the earth will be this reliable place for us to work together.
Great. So what does Noah have to do?
Nothing. And that's what's so interesting about this first covenant, is that God is promising to be faithful, even though he knows humans won't be.
The next time we see God make a covenant is with a man named Abraham. God chooses him, promises to bless him, give him a large family, lots of land where they can flourish.
And in return, God asks Abraham to trust him and train up his family to do what is right and just. And the whole reason for this covenant is God says that somehow he's going to bring his blessing to all families of the world through this one family.
So that's Abraham. The next time we see God make a covenant is when Abraham's family grows into the tribe of Israel.
And this covenant is with the whole tribe. God asks them to obey a set of laws, which are these guidelines for living well as a community of God's partners. And if they do this, then God promises to bless them and that they will become a people who then represent him to the rest of humanity.
That's the covenant with Israel. The last covenant is with King David.
Yeah, the tribe of Israel has become this large nation, ruled by David. And God asked David and his descendants to partner with him by leading Israel in obeying the laws and doing what is right and just. And God promises that one day, one of David's sons will come and extend God's kingdom of peace and blessing over all the nations.
So those are the 4 covenants that God makes in order to restore his partnership with the whole world.
But here's what happens. Israel breaks the covenant. They worship other gods, they allow horrible injustice, and so they lose their land and are forced off into exile.
So it seems hopeless. But during this time, Israel's prophets talked about a day when God would restore these covenants in spite of Israel's failure, somehow.
Yeah, they called it the New Covenant. And this is actually what's so interesting about Jesus, is that he's introduced into this story as the one who fulfills all of these covenant relationships. We're told that he's from the family of Abraham, and so he will bring the blessings of that family to the whole world. We're told that he's the faithful Israelite who was able to truly obey the law. And we're told that he's the king from the line of David, and so he goes about extending God's kingdom of justice and peace to all.
And that's really remarkable for one guy.
Yeah, and what it highlights is perhaps the most surprising claim of all made about this man, that Jesus is no mere human, but rather God become human. And God did this in order to be that faithful covenant partner that we are all made to be, but have failed to be. And so through Jesus, God has opened up a way for anyone to be in a renewed partnership with him.
So Jesus calls people to follow him and become part of this new covenant family.
And despite their failures, Jesus is committed to making them into partners who are becoming more and more faithful.
The story of the Bible ends with a vision of a fully renewed world, full of goodness and peace.
And there's this renewed humanity there, partnering together with God to expand the goodness of his creation. And so the end of the Bible story is really a new beginning.
Yeah, that's on YouTube. I can get you all the link. So, in the Bible, you have all these various covenants, and some people divide it up in different ways. These are kind of the main covenants that we talk about, and then obviously the new covenant, okay? And so we've looked at God's promise to Noah. Now, obviously, in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, there's a focus on the Abrahamic covenant. I love how the video shows Jesus coming along and basically picking up the pieces, because in each and every one of these, we have fallen short. Each and every one of us fallen short of the glory of God. He's the perfect Israelite. He's the son of David who is going to reign over the kingdom and so forth. But as we come to Genesis 17, major chapter in Genesis, and the focus on the covenant of circumcision. So let's just start reading. Look at the first couple of verses here. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. So you've got a pretty good gap of time, over a decade or so, that has passed since the events of chapter 16. So one of the things that I think sometimes we miss when we read the Bible is we see all these supernatural events. And so we read the events of chapter 16, and we're like, wow, and then we read events of chapter 17. This is over a decade apart, okay? So it's not like God's dropping down every day and having these supernatural appearances. They're going years and years sometimes. Perhaps, at least there's nothing recorded, where they're not experiencing angels dropping down, God speaking to them audibly or anything like that. And so these are special circumstances. But he is the Lord God Almighty, El Shaddai. That's where we get that phrase, El Shaddai. The Lord God Almighty could mean God of the mountains. There's a lot of debate about that word Shaddai and where it comes from. But he renews this covenant commitment to Abraham. Verse 3, Abram fell face down, and God said to him, As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be called Abraham, for I have made you the father of many nations. This is what Abraham means, father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. So this is a new line. Okay, remember earlier, a lot of this is repeated. He's repeating a lot of this. This is a new phrase. Kings will come from you. Okay, so when we think about all the families of the earth, he's talking about all the nations will be blessed through you. Kings will come from you. In verse 7, I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and to be the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan where you now reside as a foreigner I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. So a lot of this is simply a repetition of what he's already said earlier. And I don't know about you, but sometimes it's helpful if the Lord really reiterates something that he's told me before, right? And so this is what he's doing with Abraham. He's renewing this covenant. Now he's about to get into the sign of the covenant. Verse 9, Then God said to Abraham, as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you for generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and you for the generations to come. And every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or bought with money from a foreigner, those who are not your offspring, whether born in your household or bought with your money, they must be circumcised. My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So this idea of circumcision is a sign of the covenant. And it's what we were saying earlier. Notice it's not just his biological offspring. It's anybody in his household, okay? Anybody at all that is associated with him must be circumcised, and that is a sign of their loyalty to Yahweh. Okay, this is a sign of their commitment to Yahweh. Yahweh is going to bless. He's going to make them into a great nation. You're going to give them a great name, going to give them the land, going to do all this stuff. He's going to be their God. But their act of commitment, their sign of loyalty to God, their allegiance to God is demonstrated through circumcision. Verse 15, God also said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Now, I think at this phase, Ishmael is 13 years old. Okay, Ishmael is 13 years old, and now God is saying specifically, your offspring is going to come through Sarah. By the way, this is the only character in the Bible, the only female character in the Bible, I believe, if I'm correct, whose name is changed. Okay, so an interesting part there. So obviously, Abraham took this great. Verse 17, he fell face down and he laughed. And he said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. So now he's having this conversation with God. And maybe at this point he's thinking to himself, perhaps Ishmael's still going to be the guy. But God says this, verse 19, then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son. You will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. So God has a plan. It's what we call the Abrahamic covenant. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who turns into Israel. God has this covenant with them, not through Ishmael. Now skip down, if you would, verse 23. On that very day, Abraham took his son Ishmael and all those born in his household or bought with his money, every male in his household, and circumcised them as God told him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and his son Ishmael was 13. Abraham and his son Ishmael were both circumcised on that very day, and every male in Abraham's household, including those born in his household or bought from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So everybody in the household is going to follow along with this change of circumstances, so to speak, and enter into agreement, this covenant agreement. All right, so that is kind of an overview of chapter 17. Have just a few minutes. We could say more about chapter 17, but want to give you just a few minutes if you have questions, comments, before we wrap it up tonight. Yes.
In early biblical times, people lived a whole lot longer. Like Noah was 950 years old. So was Sarah being 90 and Abraham being 99, was that anywhere comparable to being that age in our current?
Yeah, well, I think just listening to their response to the news, I do think it's comparable because they, he laughed. He's thinking, my wife's 90 years old. So for them, they see this as a genuine miracle from God, okay? And you see this from time to time. And think about this. For 90 years, she's been barren. For 90 years. And no matter what, at one point, obviously, they lost their way and said, okay, go to Hagar and let's try a different plan. And that was 13 years earlier, and still radio silence after that. And but for them, I don't think Abraham would have fell down laughing, except for the fact that it was comparable to our current situation. Do we know how old he was when he died? We do. I don't know that off the top of my head. Bible trivia. Anybody know how old Abraham was when he died? Anybody? Was he 120? I don't know. Somebody Google it. Hey Siri, how old was Abraham when he died? Yeah. I do think he was. Yeah. 175 years old. Okay. So to be 100, that would be like being in his 60s maybe, My dad was 51 when I was born, and every time he would come to eat with me at the school, everybody would think he was my granddad. And anyway, so he at least understood a little bit about what it was like to have, he thought he was done. Surprise, surprise. Anyway, but it was at least comparable enough to where he knew we are really old to have a kid. Yeah, that was a miracle for them to have.
Long enough to father a child.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it was a miracle.
Middle age.
It was a miracle, yeah. Okay. So there you go. Yeah. So not exactly where we are today, although I do think we've had some people live, over 110 or whatever. I don't know what the record is, but it's on up there. But I'm betting they did not have any children when they were 100.
So, Jared, why was there no covenant requirement for women?
Well, I think in their context, that was that was a sign that God came up with. It doesn't say why. We know once we get to the New Testament, that changes, and everybody can participate with a sign of their allegiance to the Lord. But it really doesn't say anything about that in the Old Testament. It's probably because in the Old Testament, particularly in the Old Testament, men called all the shots for the most part. From an authority, from a patriarchal sense, they pretty much called the shots. And so whatever decisions they made would have flowed down to everybody else. So.
Exactly seemed fair.
Yeah, well, it kind of goes back to Genesis 3:16. It's what we talked about. It's a consequence of the fall in the Old Testament. So we can say a lot more about that, but we'll leave it there tonight and let you stew on that. So thank you for being here. Next week we will be in Genesis chapter 18, and we'll start looking at that. hopefully group in a few chapters next week, might even get to Sodom and Gomorrah.